First of all, I just want to thank you all. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Manuel and Consuelo. Thanks to all of you who have worked to bring Lin Zhao's story to the Spanish-speaking world. Thank you for the question. I think the short answer is that I was drawn by the rarity of her voice. She had this rare voice at a time of so much revolutionary sameness, same hatred, same hysteria, and the same idolatry of Mao. There, under Mao's rule, tens of millions of people lost their lives. But they died as silent victims. Their voices were unheard. There were only a few cases of political dissidents during Mao's era. But even those few cases of dissidents were really sort of unorthodox ideas within the boundary of communist ideology, of Mao's revolutionary ideology. Lin Zhao was the first to break away from that state ideology. And that, I think, was made possible by her Christian faith. Because that Christian faith gave her an independent set of values. It gave her that spiritual independence, but it also gave her courage, moral courage, to condemn the evil of Mao's totalitarian regime. Now, as you can imagine, researching this book was not easy. I am grateful that the research and the writing of this book was made possible by the appearance in 2013, the appearance of her collected writings, including almost 500,000 words of her prison writings that appeared in 2013. And so that was the most important basis of the writing of this book. But I also conducted interviews with those who knew her intimately, her past friends, her former fiancé, her fellow counter-revolutionaries, and also her some of the political prisoners in the prisons, that in the detention house and prison where she was kept. But I also got to interview some of the officials within that system, including the judge, and I'm grateful for that. Even though many people were still reluctant to speak out, so there were a few who declined to be interviewed. But I'm grateful that more people actually agreed to be interviewed by me. Now, there are still missing documents. The biggest hole in this Lin Zhao story is the primary file in the prison system that the prison system kept on Lin Zhao. It's called a primary file. What was returned to her family, and that became the basis of my biography of Lin Zhao, was from the secondary file. But the primary file is still classified. It's still kept in a secret location. So I hope one day that primary file, which contained her interrogation records, and very possibly some other writings, other prison writings, one day that file will become available. But I think overall, it is really a miracle that her writings, her prison writings, were preserved and not destroyed. I am grateful that I have been given this opportunity to research her story, to write this biography, and to help keep her memory alive. You know, Mao's regime, this totalitarian regime, saw itself as godlike, like God, all-powerful, able to crush every individual. But I think Lin Zhao's story proved that the human spirit to be free, that spirit is indomitable. That spirit cannot be crushed. So I think Lin Zhao's story can bear witness to that human spirit. And I'm particularly grateful that this book now has appeared in the Spanish edition, so that now it can speak beyond the English-speaking world to the Spanish-speaking world. It is very clear that Lin Zhao wanted to speak not just to the Chinese. She saw her struggle not just as a Chinese struggle of a Chinese individual, of a Chinese Christian. She saw her struggle as a part of that humanity struggle to be free, to have human dignity. And so I'm very grateful that with the publication of the Spanish edition, now that story can be known to the Spanish-speaking community. Well, I have been pleased that with the publication of the book, her story has now become known in America. Her story has now appeared in the Wall Street Journal after the publication of the book. It has appeared in the Chinese edition of New York Times and many other mainstream media outlets. And last year, a new music piece, a chamber music piece entitled Elegy, was composed and then premiered by several musicians from the Boston Symphony Orchestra, which became another way to pay tribute to Lin Zhao. Thank you for that question. It's actually a very important one. That film is called Searching for Lin Zhao's Soul. It is available on YouTube. And it's made by an independent Chinese filmmaker who has become a good friend of mine. It has very basic English translation, but it has these images that will help us come to know Lin Zhao. So I highly recommend that documentary film, Searching for Lin Zhao's Soul. Her story first became known in the early 1980s, when the story came out about her particularly brutal part of her execution, which is after she was shot. The authorities, the police came to demand a 5-cent bullet fee from her family. But that was a time when a few people came to notice her. But it's only in more recent years, with some of her writings becoming available on the internet, particularly one long letter that she wrote to the People's Daily, which is the biggest newspaper, the mouthpiece of the party in China. She wrote a letter to the People's Daily in 1965, and that letter has become available on the internet, and that has inspired many people. And so she has become a kind of a Promethean fire to the contemporary Chinese democracy movement. On the other hand, the government has very tight control of information. So Hu Jie's film, Searching for Lin Zhao's Soul, is not available inside China. So that kind of government control limits people's ability to get to know Lin Zhao's story. It's a question that I've been asking myself also, but I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to that question. What I do know is that, what I can say is that when I was researching the book, I had to keep a very low profile, including my trying to interview people. So I was happy that I was able to complete my research. But as to what has happened since then, since the publication of the book, I do not know. I do not know whether some in the government have become very unhappy with the book. I just do not know. But I would assume that the government sees this kind of exposition as undermining its political legitimacy, the legitimacy of the communist regime. So if they come to know this story, they will not be happy with it. Excellent question. That the humanity part should not surprise us. By the time Lin Zhao began her descent, more than one generation of Chinese intellectuals had been exposed to Western liberalism, Western ideas of democracy. That began with the May 4th movement of 1919. And so you have half a century of Western influence in China. And that influence has highlighted those issues that are very common to humanity, issues about human freedom, about dignity, about justice. So Lin Zhao also inherited that part. There's a Chinese liberal tradition influenced by the West that also helped to shape Lin Zhao. But it also shaped hundreds of thousands of other Chinese intellectuals. Why did that humanism or liberalism why did that liberalism not make a difference during the Mao era? Now that brings us to Lin Zhao's Christian faith. She made it very clear in her own prison writing that she did that. She carried on that fight because she was a Christian. She said she was sticking to this, what she called the political line of Christ. So she saw that as more than a political struggle. She saw that her dissent and her resistance to communist dictatorship, to totalitarianism, she saw it as a spiritual battle. And that is why I made it clear in the book that there was not a single instance of the kind of open and sustained dissent that was purely secular during the Mao era. And I believe that her dissent was made possible precisely because it was not just purely secular. It was both out of her humanist liberal belief and out of her Christian convictions. We can speak of two possible kinds of opposition. One is within the party. The more liberal, progressive wings within the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party. And I'm afraid those elements within the party have very much been silenced within the last, particularly in the past decade. It has always been difficult for the reform faction within the party to carry on their work. And I cannot speak to the details there because I don't know the inside struggles. But I think the larger picture that we have is that the current regime has been able to crush the intra-party dissent, those dissent within the party. But outside of the party, there's all the time, there is this ongoing search for democracy. The late Nobel Peace Laureate, Liu Xiaobo, he once wrote a book called The Future of the Free Society in China is in the among the people. And that is, we find hope, maybe not in organized opposition to the party, but in these spontaneous, unorganized, but ongoing and continuing efforts, struggles of individuals who want to fight to defend their own rights, their freedoms, and their dignity. So right now, even though there is no organized opposition to totalitarianism, but it is impossible, it is no longer possible to crush that human spirit. And so we see human rights lawyers all the time. We see individuals like the Xu Zhangren of Tsinghua University, a legal scholar, professor, who has this moral courage to decry the current repressive regime. I have tremendous respect for those people inside China who continue to carry on the fight. As you can imagine, it was not an easy book to write. And some of the story, the details of the story can become very depressing. In fact, even now, more recently, when I went back to some of the details, I could feel how difficult it was. I was reminded of how difficult it was sometimes when I was working on the book. But I was able to find a way to deal with that. I was working on a different research project which made me feel better. I was working on a project about some of the minority peoples who have been marginalized by the Chinese, majority Chinese, who live on the borders between China and its Southeast Asian neighbors, how those people found hope and regain their sense of human worth because of their contact with Christianity. They embrace Christianity as a way to affirm their human worth. And I found that story very inspiring. So I work on 2 projects at the same time, and the other project helped me cope with the depressing part of writing this book. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate having this opportunity to have this conversation.